Hello, in this video we're going to quickly just define what a function is and talk about some terminology that's essential. Don't worry if you don't memorize it all now. We're going to use this terminology over and over again and eventually it will stick. What I do encourage you to do though is as you're talking about this with your friends and colleagues and whomever, use the correct terminology. Using the correct terminology is really important because it allows you to work more effectively with other programmers. So what's a function? A function is a small section of code that can be called upon in a program. Functions are often generic in nature and will accept values to use when it runs. A function may or may not return a value to be processed. So if you've been following along in these videos, you've actually been using quite a few functions. For example, print is a function. Print, the name of the function is print, and we pass it a string to be processed. And what that means is that it prints it to the screen. The various math module contains a whole bunch of functions. What we're interested in now is actually writing our own functions. And in order to understand that, let's just take a quick example of math. Hopefully, perhaps you're at a stage where you haven't learned this yet, but you might have learned something like y equals x plus 1, which is a linear relationship. So what happens is we substitute values of x in, and that returns a value of y. Well, as you advance in mathematics, we actually can write it out exactly the same, but we write it out like this. And then we replace the y with this thing called f of x. So we say f is a function of x. So the name of the function here, name of function is f, and the parameter is x. So in order to evaluate the expression, you need to pass in one value of x. So what I can do then is I can say f at 2, and this is said f at 2, meaning, and essentially what this is saying is, this is saying what is y when x equals 2. And then we can evaluate that. We replace x with 2 to get 3. So this is what we learn in high school. And then often in first year university or sometimes later in high school, we start looking at functions with multiple parameters. So we might say g as a function of x, y, and z. And maybe that function is defined as x times y times z. So I can say g of 1, 2, 3, and I simply substitute those values in, and I generate that value of 6. Now, if you haven't done that in math and you're a younger student, that might be a little confusing, but don't worry. What we want to think about when we talk about functions are a couple essential things. First off, we want to understand that function, method, and procedure are pretty much interchangeable terms. We tend to use the term associated with the language. So Python, we talk about functions. Java, we talk about methods. And Pascal, we talk about procedures. They mean the same thing. There are some technical differences, I believe, but really, for all intents and purposes, it doesn't matter to us. For Python, we want to talk about a module. A module is where the actual methods are contained, or functions are contained. So for example, we've learned how to use the math module, and the math module contains a bunch of functions. Parameters are what is needed for the function to run. So if I tell you that there is some function, and let's use the math as an example. I'm going to come out here and do a little bit of coding. So let's import math. And if I do something like x is equal to math dot square root 9, the parameter is an integer value. That's what math, the square root function, requires to work. Arguments are what we actually pass to it. So the parameter is an integer, and in this specific case, the argument is the value 9. People will often use the terms parameter and argument interchangeably, but they actually mean slightly different things. So parameters are what is required for the function to run. Arguments are the actual values that are passed. The name of the function is how we call upon it. So in this example, the function is called sqrt, which is short form for square root. And the return value is what is passed out when the function is done. So when this function is done executing, it generates the square root of whatever is passed to it, and then we can do whatever we want with it. So for example, we can put it into the variable x, and I could say something like print x. So those are the important terms when we talk about functions. We want to be able to talk about the module that the function is contained within. We want to be able to talk about the parameters, that is what is needed for the function to run. We want to talk about the arguments, those are the actual values passed, the name of the function, and the return value. And with Python, return values are really, really nice because you don't have to specify what type of values to be returned. In our next video, we're going to actually write a function and see how all this kind of comes together.